Some mysteries change us more than we change them. In the frozen heart of Montana Territory, 1880, an old cowboy and his faithful dog discovered something impossible. Eli Brecker, a weathered trail scout nearing 70, rode through deep snow to check a trapper's cabin before the blizzard hit. Inside, he found a starving donkey tied in silence. No tracks, no note, no answers. As Eli searched for the truth, family secrets he'd buried for decades began to surface: a long-lost brother, an unpaid debt, and a past that refused to die. What began as a simple rescue became a reckoning with the man he'd been. What could connect this abandoned animal to the buried shadows of Eli's own history? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the promise of snow across the high country, that particular bite to the air that only comes when a real storm is brewing. Eli Brecker stood on the porch of his cabin, one weathered hand resting on the rail his own father had hewn from lodgepole pine 40 years back. The wood was smooth under his palm, worn by time and touch into something that felt more like stone than timber. He was a tall man still, though age had bent him some at the shoulders. Nearly 70 winters in Montana Territory had carved lines deep into his face, each one a map of hard seasons and harder choices. His hands were gnarled, the knuckles thick from decades of gripping reins in cold that could freeze your fingers to the leather. But his eyes, pale blue like mountain ice, remained sharp. A trail scout couldn't afford to lose his vision. And Eli Brecker had been scouting these mountains longer than most men in Copper Ridge had been alive. Beside him, close enough to touch his leg, sat Rusty. The cattle dog was 12 years old now, his red-brown coat going gray around the muzzle. The dog's ears were pricked forward, tracking the same weather Eli was feeling in his bones. They'd been together so long that sometimes Eli thought they shared the same thoughts. More than once, Rusty had kept him from walking into trouble, whether it was a startled bear or a trail washed out by spring runoff. "Going to be a hard one," Eli said, more to himself than the dog. Rusty's tail thumped once against the porch boards. Agreement in his way. The cabin sat in a clearing about 3 miles outside Copper Ridge, close enough to town for supplies, but far enough out that Eli could have the quiet he preferred. It was a simple structure, one main room with a sleeping loft and a stone fireplace that drew clean. He'd built it himself 30 years back, after Martha passed. Before that, they'd lived in town, above the feed store where she'd kept the books and he'd worked when he wasn't out on the trails. But after she was gone, the town felt too full of memories and too empty of the one person who mattered. So he'd come out here, to a piece of land that looked toward the mountains and didn't ask him questions he couldn't answer. The interior was spare, but comfortable. A narrow bed in the loft, a table and 2 chairs by the fire, shelves that held his few books and fewer treasures. On the mantel sat a photograph of Martha, taken in Butte on their wedding day. She was smiling in it, that particular smile she'd saved just for him, the one that said she saw past all his rough edges to something worth keeping. Next to the photograph was a tarnished brass compass, the needle still true after all these years. That compass had belonged to his father. Old Samuel Brecker had carried it through the Mexican War and across the plains, when Montana was still wilderness without a name. He taught both his sons how to read it, how to trust it when the trails disappeared and the mountains all looked the same. "A man needs to know where he is," Samuel used to say, "and a compass will tell you that, long as you're honest about where you started." Eli reached up and touched the compass now, feeling the cool brass under his fingertips. He'd carried it every day since his father died, 45 years back. It rode in his vest pocket close to his heart, a weight he'd grown so used to he only noticed it when he reached to make sure it was still there. His father had wanted him to give the compass to Thomas, his younger brother. Said Thomas was the one who'd need it more, being the restless one, the one who wanted to see what was over the next ridge. But Thomas had left before Eli could pass it on, and by the time Eli understood what his father had meant, it was too late. Thomas, The name still carried weight after all these years, a stone he'd learned to carry, but never learned to set down. They'd been close once, him and Thomas. 2 years apart, with Eli the elder by just enough that he'd always felt responsible for his little brother. They'd learned to ride together, to track together, to read the weather and the land together under their father's patient guidance. Thomas had been quick with a laugh and quicker with his hands, good at leatherwork in a way Eli never managed. Their father used to say Thomas had artist's fingers, while Eli had a scout's eyes. The last time Eli saw his brother, they'd been standing in this very clearing, though there'd been no cabin here then. Just a stand of pines and a view toward the peaks. Their father was 3 months in the ground, and Eli was trying to hold together everything Samuel had built. Thomas had other ideas. He wanted to try his hand at prospecting, wanted to head into the high country with a pan and a dream and see what he could find. "It's foolish," Eli had said. He'd been 24 then, feeling every bit the weight of being the oldest, the responsible one. Pa spent 40 years building something solid. You want to throw that away chasing gold that probably isn't even there? "I'm not throwing anything away," Thomas had replied, his jaw set in that stubborn way he had. "I'm trying to make something of my own. Is that so hard to understand?" "What's hard to understand," Eli had shot back, his own temper rising, "is why you can't see what we've got right here. This land, this life Pa built for us. That's worth more than some played-out gold claim." The argument had gone on from there, voices rising, old resentments bubbling up the way they do when grief is fresh and patience is thin. Eli said things about duty and responsibility, about growing up and facing reality. Thomas said things about following your own path and not living in someone else's shadow. In the end, Thomas had packed his gear and ridden out, heading south toward Wyoming. He'd looked back once from the tree line, and Eli had stood watching him go, too proud to call him back, too angry to admit he might be wrong. That was 45 years ago this spring. Eli had never seen his brother again. For the first few years, he'd expected Thomas to come back, tail between his legs, ready to admit that Eli had been right. When that didn't happen, Eli convinced himself he didn't care. Thomas had made his choice, and a man had to live with his choices. But as the years rolled on, and the silence stretched, Eli began to understand what he'd lost. Not just a brother, but the chance to say he was sorry, the chance to tell Thomas that being right wasn't worth being alone. He'd searched for Thomas in his way, asked questions in the towns he passed through on his scouting jobs, listened for rumors or mentions of a Brecker making his way in Wyoming or Dakota or wherever the prospectors were working. But it was like Thomas had vanished into the mountains the way snow vanishes in spring, leaving no trace behind except the memory of it having been there. "Morning." "Eli." The voice broke his reverie, and Eli turned to see Doc Harlan making his way up the trail from town. The doctor was a decade younger than Eli, but looked older, soft-living, and too much whiskey catching up with him. Still, he had a good heart and steady hands, and he'd been the closest thing to a friend Eli had let himself have since Martha passed. "Doc." Eli nodded. "Saw the weather coming in?" Harlan said, climbing the steps to the porch with a slight wheeze. "Thought you might be heading up to check on Jennings' cabin before it hits." Eli nodded again. Jennings was a trapper who worked the high country, staying up at his cabin through most of the year except the deepest winter, when even he had to admit defeat and come down to Copper Ridge. He was due back in town any day now, but if the storm caught him up there, he'd be stuck until spring. It was the kind of thing neighbors looked after, making sure everyone was accounted for before the mountains became impassable. "Planning on it," Eli said. "Leave in an hour or so, be back before the snow gets serious. You want company?" Eli shook his head. "Appreciate it, but I know the trail. Besides, someone should stay in town in case anyone else needs help." Harlan accepted this with a slight smile. They both knew that what Eli really meant was that he preferred going alone, the way he preferred most things alone these days. But Harlan was good about not pushing, one of the reasons they'd stayed friends as long as they had. "You take care up there," Harlan said. "And Eli, if you see anything odd, anything that doesn't feel right, you come straight back." Don't take chances at your age. My age, Eli said with something that might have been amusement, is the same as it was yesterday, and I managed fine then. After Harlan left, Eli went about his preparations with the methodical care of a man who'd learned that haste caused mistakes, and mistakes in the high country could kill you. He saddled his gelding, a sturdy bay named Prophet, who was getting on in years himself, but still sure-footed in rough terrain. He packed light, some jerky, hardtack, a canteen of water, matches wrapped in oilcloth, a length of rope, and his rifle. The compass went into his vest pocket where it always rode. Rusty watched these preparations with the keen interest of a dog who knew a journey was coming. Before they set out, Eli stopped by the general store in Copper Ridge. Margaret Holloway ran the place now, her husband having passed 2 winters back. She was a handsome woman in her 60s, with iron-grey hair and a no-nonsense manner that Eli appreciated. "Storm supplies?" she asked, already pulling items from the shelves. "Just checking on Jennings," Eli said. "He should have been back by now." Her voice carried a note of worry. Jennings was well-liked in his peculiar way. A quiet man who kept his own counsel but always paid his debts and never caused trouble. Probably just lost track of time, Eli said, though he didn't entirely believe it. Jennings was too experienced to misjudge the weather. Margaret handed him a small bundle. "Extra coffee and some of those hard candies he likes, just in case you find him up there and he's running low." Eli accepted the bundle with a nod of thanks. As he turned to leave, Margaret spoke again, her voice softer. "Eli, you remember when Thomas left? You told everyone you didn't want to hear his name again." He stopped, his hand on the door. "I remember. Well, I've respected that all these years. But I wanted you to know, in case it matters now, that I never thought you were right about that. Some things are worth holding on to, even when they hurt, maybe especially when they hurt." Eli looked back at her, seeing the kindness in her weathered face, and felt something shift in his chest. "I appreciate that, Margaret. More than you might know." The ride up to Jennings' cabin took the better part of 3 hours. The trail climbed steadily, winding through stands of pine and aspen that were already bare for winter. Snow lay in patches where the sun didn't reach, and the air grew colder as they gained elevation. Rusty loped ahead, ranging out to explore interesting scents, but always circling back to make sure Eli was following. The mountains rose around them, ancient and indifferent, their peaks already white with snow that wouldn't melt until spring. Eli had spent most of his life in these mountains, and they felt more like home than any building ever had. Out here, with just the wind and the trees and the vast silence, he could think clearly. The clutter of town life, the small talk and social obligations fell away until there was just him and the trail and the task at hand. But today, his thoughts kept circling back to Thomas. Maybe it was Margaret's words, or maybe it was just the particular loneliness of an approaching winter, but Eli found himself remembering things he'd tried hard to forget. The way Thomas used to whistle while he worked leather, always the same tune their mother had sung when they were small. The way he'd laugh at his own jokes, even when nobody else found them funny. The way he'd looked that last day, hurt and angry and determined, riding away into a future that didn't include his brother. Eli pulled his coat tighter against the wind and urged Prophet forward. The past was the past, and dwelling on it wouldn't change anything. What mattered now was making sure Jennings was safe and getting back to his own cabin before the storm hit in earnest. But as he rode, one hand reached unconsciously to his vest pocket, feeling the solid weight of his father's compass. A reminder of who he'd been and who he'd lost, and the long, silent years between then and now. Jennings' cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by spruce, built solid against a rock outcropping that gave it shelter from the worst of the north winds. As Eli approached, he noticed first what wasn't there. No smoke from the chimney, no tracks in the fresh snow that had fallen during the night, no sign of the trapper anywhere. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, moving in the wind with a slow creak that raised the hair on the back of Eli's neck. Rusty had gone still beside Prophet, his hackles up, a low whine building in his throat. The dog sensed something wrong, and after 12 years together, Eli had learned to trust that instinct. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured, dismounting with the caution of a man who'd lived long enough to know that trouble came in many forms. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard, levered around into the chamber, and approached the cabin with slow, measured steps. The wind pushed the door open wider as he neared, and Eli caught a glimpse of the interior, dim, no fire burning but something moving in the shadows. He raised the rifle, his heart beating hard in his chest, every sense alert. "Jennings," he called out. "It's Eli Brecker. You in there?" No answer came, but the movement continued, accompanied now by a sound that didn't fit, the soft shuffle of hooves on wooden planking, and then a low, plaintive bray that echoed through the clearing. Eli lowered the rifle and stepped to the doorway, peering inside. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the gloom, but when they did, he found himself staring at something he couldn't quite process. A donkey stood in the middle of Jennings' cabin, tied by a rope to the center support beam. The animal was thin, its ribs showing through dull, matted fur, but its eyes were alert, watching Eli with an intelligence that seemed almost human in its intensity. The donkey didn't bray again, just stood there in that impossible silence, waiting. Eli stepped inside, his mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The cabin was cold, the hearth long since gone dark. There was no food set out, no gear of any kind, nothing to suggest Jennings had been here recently. The floor was clean, except for the droppings around the donkey, and those looked to be several days old at least. But it was the lack of tracks outside that made Eli's skin crawl. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, enough to cover anything older than 12 hours. Yet there were no tracks approaching the cabin, no sign of how the donkey had gotten here or who had tied it inside. It was as if the animal had simply appeared, conjured out of the mountain air. Eli moved closer, speaking in the gentle tones he used with horses. "Easy there, friend. Let's have a look at you." The donkey nickered softly, but didn't pull away as Eli ran his hands over its coat, checking for injuries. It was malnourished and dehydrated, but otherwise appeared sound. Someone had cared for this animal once, though it had clearly been neglected for some time now. The rope that held it was tied professionally, not too tight, with enough length that the donkey could move and lie down. This wasn't the work of someone being cruel, but of someone who knew animals and wanted this one to be found. It was when Eli reached the donkey's head that his hand froze. The halter was old but well made, and hanging from it was a bridle, the leather worn soft with age and use. He'd seen thousands of bridles in his life, but this one made his breath catch in his throat. The tooling on the leather was distinctive, a pattern of interlocking ovals and small star shapes, done in a style Eli had only ever seen one person use. His hands trembled as he traced the familiar marks, seeing in his mind a younger man bent over a workbench, leather working tools spread before him. Tongue caught between his teeth in concentration as he stamped out that exact pattern. Thomas. This was Thomas's work. Eli would stake his life on it. He'd watched his brother make a dozen such bridles when they were young, had even tried to copy the technique himself, but never managed to get the stars quite right. But Thomas had the touch for it, the patience and the eye for detail that turned simple leather into something beautiful. Eli's legs felt suddenly weak, and he reached out to steady himself against the donkey's neck. The animal stood quiet, as if understanding the moment for what it was, a man coming face to face with a past he'd thought was buried. How had Thomas's bridle ended up here, on a donkey tied in an abandoned cabin in the Montana high country? And why was there no explanation, no note, no sign of who had left it or why? The questions crashed over Eli like a wave, pulling him back to that day 45 years ago, to that final argument and the sight of Thomas riding away. He'd convinced himself over the years that Thomas was probably dead, had died young the way so many prospectors did, his body lying in some unnamed gulch where no one would ever find it. It was easier to think that than to imagine Thomas alive somewhere, living a life that didn't include his brother, choosing to stay away. But this bridle said different. Someone had brought it here, Someone who knew about Thomas and knew about Eli. Someone who wanted Eli to find it, to ask these questions, to start down a path he couldn't yet see. Eli examined the rest of the cabin with new eyes, looking for anything else that might give him answers. The trapper's gear was gone, all of it, cleared out as thoroughly as if Jennings had never lived here at all. The shelves were empty, the cupboards bare. Even the woodpile beside the hearth had been taken, leaving only a few scattered pieces. But in the corner, half hidden by shadow, Eli found something else, a small wooden box, the kind used to store tobacco or other precious items. Inside was a measure of oats, enough to feed the donkey for a few days, and a note written in a hand Eli didn't recognize. The message was brief: "Take care of him. He's all that's left." Eli read the note 3 times, trying to find meaning in the sparse words. Take care of him? Who was giving this instruction? And what did all that's left mean? All that was left of what or whom? Outside, the wind was picking up, and the sky had taken on that peculiar yellow-gray color that promised heavy snow within hours. Eli knew he should leave now, get back to his cabin, while he still could. But he couldn't leave the donkey here to starve, and besides, this animal was a clue, maybe the only one he'd ever get to understanding what had happened to Thomas. He checked the rope and found it easy to untie. The donkey followed him docilely out of the cabin, blinking in the sudden daylight. Rusty approached cautiously, sniffing at the newcomer, and to Eli's surprise, the dog's tail began to wag. Whatever Rusty sensed in this donkey, it wasn't a threat. "All right then," Eli said, more to himself than the animals. "Looks like you're coming home with me." He fashioned a lead from a length of rope in his pack and tied it to the donkey's halter, being careful not to disturb the bridle. That piece of leather was evidence, proof of something he didn't yet understand, but needed to. The donkey came along willingly, walking beside Prophet as if they'd traveled together for years. As they left the clearing, Eli looked back once at the cabin, at the door still standing open to the wind and the empty interior beyond. Nothing about this made sense. The timing, the location, the complete absence of tracks in fresh snow. It all felt like a message written in a language he was only beginning to remember how to read. The first snowflakes began to fall as they started down the trail, fat and heavy, the kind that would accumulate fast. Eli urged Prophet into a quicker pace, the donkey keeping up without complaint. Behind them, the cabin disappeared into the white, and ahead, the trail home stretched out uncertain, but in his vest pocket, the compass pointed true, and in his hands, he held the lead rope of an animal that carried his brother's mark. For the first time in 45 years, Eli felt like he was heading towards something instead of away from it, even if he had no idea what that something might be. The journey back tested Eli in ways he hadn't expected. The snow came down thick and fast, cutting visibility to a few yards. Prophet knew the trail well enough to manage, but the donkey struggled, unused to such deep drifts and clearly weakened by days of neglect. More than once, Eli had to dismount and coax the animal forward, his hands going numb despite his gloves as he pulled on the lead rope. Rusty stayed close, sometimes ranging ahead to check the trail, sometimes falling back to nip gently at the donkey's heels when it balked. The dog seemed to have adopted the donkey as part of his pack, a responsibility to be protected. Eli found himself grateful for the company of both animals as the wind howled through the trees and the world disappeared into white. By the time they reached his cabin, 3 hours had passed and the storm was in full fury. Eli's fingers were so cold he could barely work the latch on his barn door, but he managed it finally and led both animals inside out of the wind. The barn was small, meant for Prophet and the few chickens Eli kept for eggs. But there was room enough for the donkey. He rubbed both animals down with old blankets, paying particular attention to the donkey's legs and back where the cold might have settled in. The animal stood patient under his ministrations, those intelligent eyes watching him with something that might have been gratitude. Eli gave it water first, not too much, and then a small measure of hay from his winter store. The donkey ate slowly, carefully, as if it had forgotten what it felt like to have food and wanted to savor the experience. "You've been through something, haven't you, friend?" Eli said softly, running his hand down the donkey's neck. "Question is what? And who sent you to find me?" Rusty had positioned himself near the donkey, lying down with his head on his paws, but his eyes alert. The dog's acceptance of this stranger was unusual. Rusty was territorial by nature, protective of what he considered his space and his person. But with the donkey, there was none of that wariness, only a gentle watchfulness that spoke of recognition rather than suspicion. Once the animals were settled, Eli made his way through the driving snow to his cabin. Inside, he built up the fire and set coffee to boil, his hands shaking from more than just the cold. The bridle hung on a peg by the door, where he'd placed it. The leather dark, with age and moisture. In the better light of his cabin, with his fingers thawed enough to work properly, Eli took the bridle down and examined it more closely. Every detail confirmed what he'd known the moment he touched it. This was Thomas's work, unmistakably so. The star pattern was perfect, each point evenly spaced, each impression the exact same depth. Their father had taught them both to tool leather, but where Eli had learned the basics and moved on, Thomas had fallen in love with the craft itself. Eli remembered winter evenings when they were young, the three of them in the workshop their father had built onto the side of the main house. Samuel would work on saddle repair while his sons practiced on scraps of leather, learning to use the mallets and stamps and edge bevelers that turned hide into something useful and beautiful. Eli had been impatient, always eager to finish and move on to the next task. But Thomas would work for hours on a single piece, getting the pattern just right, redoing anything that didn't meet his standard. "You've got the gift for this, boy," their father had said once, examining a belt Thomas had made for his 14th birthday. "Steady hands and an eye for beauty. That'll serve you well, wherever life takes you, wherever life takes you." As if Samuel had known even then that Thomas wouldn't stay, that he'd need a skill he could carry with him into whatever future he chose. Eli set the bridle on his table and poured himself coffee, standing by the fire as he drank it. The storm outside had settled into a steady howl, the kind that would last through the night and into the next day. He wouldn't be going anywhere until it passed, which gave him time to think, to try to piece together what little he knew into something that made sense. A donkey, tied in an abandoned cabin. A bridle made by his brother 45 years ago, or in his style, if Thomas had taught someone else his technique. A note that said, "Take care of him, he's all that's left." And no tracks, no sign of how any of it had gotten there. The note bothered him most. It suggested something had ended, something had been lost. If Thomas had made that bridle, if Thomas was somehow connected to this mystery, did the note mean Thomas was dead? Was the donkey all that was left of his brother's life, sent to Eli as a final message? But if Thomas was dead, who had arranged all this? Who had brought the donkey to that specific cabin, tied it in a way that ensured it would survive long enough to be found, and made certain Eli would be the one to find it? The questions spiraled, each one leading to more questions, until Eli felt dizzy with the weight of not knowing. He finished his coffee and made himself something to eat, though he tasted none of it. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with dreams of Thomas riding away into snow, looking back one more time before the white swallowed him whole. The storm lasted through the night and into the next day, finally breaking just before sunset. Eli spent the time caring for the animals and trying to keep his mind occupied with routine tasks. But his eyes kept returning to that bridle, to those perfect stars stamped into leather that had somehow survived 4.5 decades. When the weather cleared enough for travel, Eli made a decision. He would go back to Jennings' cabin, do a more thorough search in daylight without a blizzard pressing him. If someone had left that donkey as a message, there might be more to find, other clues he'd missed in his haste to get home. The ride back took most of the morning. The trail was thick with new snow, and Prophet had to work hard to break through the drifts. But the sky was clear now. That brilliant blue that only comes after a storm has washed the air clean. And the silence was profound when Eli reached the cabin. He tied Prophet to a tree and approached on foot, Rusty ranging ahead. The door still stood open. Snow now drifted across the threshold and into the interior. Eli stepped inside and began his search, methodical and patient, checking every corner, every crack in the walls, every potential hiding place. It was Rusty who found it. The dog had been sniffing along the rafters, whining softly, and when Eli looked up, he saw something tucked into a gap between two beams. He fetched a stick and worked the object loose, catching it as it fell. A photograph, faded and creased, protected in a leather sleeve that had kept it mostly dry despite the years. Eli's hands trembled as he slid it free and held it up to the light from the door. 3 people looked back at him from the photograph. On the left, a younger version of himself, maybe 22 years old, lean and serious-faced. On the right, Thomas, barely 20, with that crooked smile and those bright eyes that saw possibilities everywhere. And between them, one hand on each son's shoulder, stood their father, Samuel Brecker, proud and strong in his prime. Eli remembered when this photograph had been taken. A traveling photographer had come through Copper Ridge the summer before their father died, offering portraits. Samuel had insisted they do it as a family, a way to mark the moment, to have something that would last. "We won't always be together," Samuel had said, "but we'll always be family, and this picture will remind us of that." Eli sank down onto a wooden crate, the photograph clutched in his cold fingers, and felt something break loose in his chest. This wasn't old, left here by accident or forgotten. This photograph had been placed here deliberately for him to find. The leather sleeve was too well maintained, too clean. Someone had kept this picture safe for decades and then brought it to this cabin, hidden it where only a careful search would reveal it. Someone who knew about him and Thomas. Someone who knew this cabin would draw Eli's attention. Someone who was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs that led back into a past Eli had spent 45 years trying to forget. He turned the photograph over, and on the back, written in that same unfamiliar hand as the note, were 3 words: "He never forgot." Eli sat in that cold cabin as the afternoon light slanted through the door, holding a picture of 3 men who'd loved each other despite their differences, and understood with absolute certainty that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Eli rode straight to Doc Harlan's office when he got back to Copper Ridge, the photograph heavy in his vest pocket next to the compass. He found the doctor tending to young Billy Morrison's broken arm, setting the bone with practiced efficiency while the boy tried hard not to cry. "Be with you in a minute." "Eli," Harlan said, not looking up from his work. "Unless you're bleeding or dying, in which case speak up now." "I'll wait," Eli said, taking a seat by the window. He watched the street outside, the familiar rhythms of small-town life continuing as always, and felt strangely detached from it all. The photograph in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest, a hot coal of questions that needed answers. When Billy and his mother had left, Harlan poured them both a measure of whiskey and settled into his chair with a slight grunt. "You have that look, Eli. The one that says you've stumbled onto something you wish you hadn't. Tell me about Thomas," Eli said without preamble. "Tell me everything you know, everything you've heard over the years, even the things you thought I didn't want to hear." Harlan's eyebrows rose. "That's a change of tune. For 45 years, you've made it clear his name wasn't to be spoken in your presence. Things have changed." Eli pulled out the photograph and laid it on Harlan's desk. "I found this yesterday up at Jennings' cabin, along with a donkey wearing a bridle Thomas made. Someone put them there for me to find." Harlan picked up the photograph, studying it with the careful attention he gave to diagnosing illness. When he looked up, his expression was troubled. "How much do you want to know, Eli? Once you start down this path, you can't unknow what you learn. Everything. Tell me everything." The doctor sighed and took a drink of his whiskey. "All right, then. About 20 years back, maybe a bit less, a man named Jakob Weiss came through town. He was a leather worker, skilled by all accounts, making his way north from Wyoming. He stopped at the store for supplies, and Margaret noticed the tooling on his saddlebags. Said it looked familiar, like work she'd seen before. "Thomas's work," Eli said quietly. "She thought so. Asked Weiss about it, and he said he'd apprenticed under a man in Wyoming, fellow named Thomas Brecker. Said Thomas was one of the best leather workers he'd ever seen, patient teacher, good man. Margaret asked if Thomas was still in Wyoming, thinking maybe you'd want to know. But Weiss said Thomas had moved on years before, somewhere into Dakota Territory, or maybe Montana, and he'd lost track of him. Eli absorbed this information, his hands tight around his whiskey glass. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you'd made it clear you didn't want to know," Harlan said gently. "And because it was second-hand information from 20 years ago. What good would it have done to tell you Thomas had maybe been alive then, maybe not anymore? To give you hope that might turn out to be false? He was my brother, he was. And you grieved for him in your way, made your peace with his loss. I wasn't going to rip that open based on one traveling leatherworker's story." Harlan leaned forward. "But this photograph changes things. Someone who knew Thomas, who had this picture, wanted you to have it. The question is why, and why now?" Eli told him about the donkey, the condition it was in, the note that said, "He's all that's left." Harlan listened without interruption, his doctor's mind already working through the implications. "If Thomas passed recently," Harlan said slowly, "and if he had family, someone who cared about him, they might want to connect that family to the brother Thomas left behind. A way of completing the circle, so to speak. A son," Eli said. "Thomas had a son. That's what the journal page I found suggested. The question is whether that son knows about me, and whether he's the one leaving these clues." They talked for another hour, running through possibilities, trying to construct a narrative that made sense of the scattered pieces. By the time Eli left, he had a plan. He would go back to the cabin one more time, take proper tools this time, and search until he found whatever else might be hidden there. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Eli packed carefully, a pry bar, a hammer, a good knife, an extra lantern for better light. He told Margaret where he was going and why, leaving the photograph with her for safekeeping. If something happened to him up there, he wanted someone to know what he'd been chasing. The cabin looked different in morning light, less ominous, just a small structure slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. Eli tied Prophet and set to work, starting with the walls. He tapped along each log, listening for hollow sounds, checking for loose chinking that might hide something. Then the floor, testing each board systematically. It was on the third pass, in the far corner where the shadows were deepest, that he found it. A board that didn't quite sit flush with its neighbors, one end slightly proud of the surface. Eli worked the pry bar under it gently, not wanting to damage whatever might be beneath, and lifted. The space below was shallow, just deep enough for a small tin box. Eli lifted it out carefully, his heart hammering against his ribs. The box was the kind used to store tobacco, but when he opened it, he found papers instead. Several sheets, folded small. The paper yellowed with age, but the ink still clear. Journal pages written in a neat, precise hand that Eli recognized as his brother's. He unfolded them with shaking fingers and began to read by the light streaming through the cabin door. The first entry was dated 40 years back, just a few years after Thomas had left. "I have been working the claims near South Pass," it read, "and while the gold hasn't panned out the way I hoped, I've found I can make a decent living with leather work. Men always need good tack, and I have a skill that's in demand. I think of home sometimes, of Pa and Eli. I wonder if they think of me, or if I've been erased from the family history like I never existed. I tell myself it's better this way, that I made my choice and must live with it. But some nights the regret sits heavy." Eli closed his eyes, pressing the paper to his chest. Thomas had thought of them, had wondered, had regretted. All those years, and they'd been separated by nothing more than pride and silence. He forced himself to continue reading. The next entry was dated 5 years later. "My boy is 2 years old now. I named him Daniel after Ma's father. He has her eyes, the same warm brown that could see straight through to your heart. His mother died bringing him into this world, and I have been both father and mother to him, as best I can. I teach him what Pa taught me, about the land and the animals and being a man of honor. Sometimes I wish he could know his grandfather, could know his Uncle Eli, but that door closed long ago, and I'm not brave enough to try opening it. A son, named Daniel. Now a man in his early 40s, if he was still alive. Eli did the arithmetic in his head, trying to picture this nephew he'd never known, this piece of Thomas that had continued into the world. The final page was more recent, perhaps 5 years old. Daniel has grown into a good man, better than I deserve. He has my skill with leather and his mother's kindness. I've told him about Montana, about the family I left behind. He asks questions I struggle to answer. How do I explain that I let pride and fear keep me from the people I loved? How do I tell him that somewhere he has an uncle who doesn't know he exists? I should have gone back years ago. I should have swallowed my shame and made things right. Now I'm old and tired, and the journey seems impossible. If I could send one message back through time to my younger self, it would be this: go home. Whatever you think you'll lose by admitting you were wrong, it's nothing compared to what you'll lose by staying away. The entry ended there, the rest of the page blank. Eli sat in the cold cabin. These fragments of his brother's life spread before him and felt the full weight of 45 years of silence. Thomas had wanted to come home, had regretted leaving, had thought of Eli through all those years of separation, and now Thomas was gone. But his son remained. Daniel, a nephew who'd grown up hearing about an uncle he'd never met, who'd lost his father and perhaps wanted to complete something Thomas hadn't been able to finish. The breadcrumb trail suddenly made sense. Daniel was leading Eli towards something, revealing Thomas's life piece by piece, building a picture of the man Thomas had been after he left. But why this way? Why the mystery and the hidden clues, instead of simply introducing himself? Unless Daniel wasn't sure of his welcome, unless he feared that Eli would reject him the way Eli had rejected Thomas, that the old wound was too deep to heal. Eli gathered the pages carefully, placing them back in the tin box. He had what he'd come for, more than he'd dared hope for. Now he needed to find Daniel, to tell this nephew that whatever had happened between him and Thomas, it ended here. The past was heavy enough without carrying it into the future. As he rode home through the winter afternoon, Eli felt something shift inside him, some long frozen thing beginning finally to thaw. He'd spent 45 years as a man, defined by his solitude, by his competence in the wilderness and his distance from human connection. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to be something different, to be the uncle Daniel had never had, to give Thomas's son the family connection that Thomas himself had wanted but been too afraid to claim. The compass in his pocket kept pointing true, just like it always had. But for the first time in decades, Eli felt like he was finally heading in the right direction. The week that followed brought a strange routine to Eli's life. Each morning he tended to the donkey, who grew stronger with each passing day. The animal's ribs began to fill out. Its coat took on a healthier sheen, and those intelligent eyes watched Eli's every movement with an attention that went beyond simple animal gratitude. But it was the donkey's behavior in the evening that captured Eli's attention and wouldn't let go. Every day, right around sunset, the animal would become agitated. It would pace the confines of the barn, ears pricked forward, braying toward the northeast mountains. Not the panicked sound of an animal in distress, but something else. A call, maybe, or a response to something only it could sense. The first few times it happened, Eli chalked it up to the donkey, settling into new surroundings, working through whatever trauma had left it tied in that cabin. But the pattern was too consistent, too specific. Always the same direction, always at sunset. Always with that same purposeful quality, as if the donkey was trying to communicate something it lacked the words to express. Rusty seemed to understand what Eli was only beginning to grasp. The dog would sit by the barn door during these episodes, looking first at the donkey and then at Eli, his tail wagging slowly as if to say, "Are you getting this? Are you understanding what's being said here?" On the fifth evening, Eli stood in the barn doorway, watching the donkey's agitation, and made a decision. This animal had been sent to him as a guide, just as surely as the compass in his pocket had guided him through countless trails. The donkey wanted him to follow, to head northeast into the high country, to find whatever truth waited there in those mountains. The question was whether an old man and an aging dog were up to the task. It would mean several days in the wilderness at a time of year when the weather was unpredictable at best. It would mean leaving the comfort of his cabin and the safety of familiar trails. It would mean trusting that this strange animal knew something he didn't, that the breadcrumb trail he'd been following had a destination worth reaching. But then again, what choice did he really have? Thomas's journal pages had opened something in Eli that couldn't be closed again. He needed to know the rest of the story, needed to find Daniel if Daniel was still out there, needed to complete what Thomas had left unfinished. The donkey was offering him a path forward, and Eli had learned long ago that refusing a gift freely offered was a kind of foolishness all its own. The next morning, Eli began his preparations. He packed for a week in the high country, food for himself and the animals, extra blankets, ammunition for his rifle, matches and kindling wrapped in oilcloth, a good knife, rope, a hatchet for cutting firewood. He checked Prophet's shoes and gave the horse an extra ration of grain, building up strength for the journey ahead. The donkey watched these preparations with something that looked like approval, as if understanding that finally, the old man was getting the message. Before setting out, Eli rode into Copper Ridge one last time. He needed to let someone know his plans, to have a voice of reason, try to talk him out of what might well be a fool's errand. If he was going to die in those mountains, he wanted someone to know where to look for his body. Margaret was stocking shelves when he entered the general store, moving with the efficiency of long practice. She looked up when the bell over the door chimed, and her expression shifted immediately from professional welcome to concern. "I know that look. Eli Brecker," she said, setting down the canned goods she'd been organizing. "That's your, I'm about to do something that'll make everyone worry look." Despite everything, Eli found himself almost smiling. "How long have you known me, Margaret?" "Long enough to read you like one of those dime novels my late husband used to hide behind the counter." She came around to face him properly. "What is it this time?" He told her about the donkey's behavior, about his plan to follow where the animal seemed to want to lead him. Margaret listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded on the counter, her expression growing more troubled with each word. "That's a lot of trust to put in an animal you've known less than 2 weeks, she said when he'd finished. "I know it, but Margaret, that donkey is connected to Thomas somehow. I'm certain of it now. And if there's even a chance that following it will lead me to answers about my brother, to maybe meeting his son, then I have to try. I've spent 45 years not trying, and look where that got me." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right, of course. Some things are worth the risk. But Eli, promise me you'll be careful. Those mountains don't care about unfinished family business. And I don't want to be explaining to Doc Harlan why I let you ride off to your death without putting up a proper fight. I'll be careful," he promised. "And I'll be back. One way or another, I'll be back." She put together supplies for him, moving through the store with practiced efficiency, adding items he hadn't thought to request. Coffee and sugar, dried apples, a small bottle of whiskey for medicinal purposes. Extra socks because your feet need taking care of at your age. As she worked, she talked, filling the space with words that felt like a blessing. "When you find what you're looking for," she said, wrapping the last of the supplies in brown paper. "And I believe you will, Eli. I want you to remember something. The past doesn't have to define the future. What happened between you and Thomas, that's done. It's the what happens next that matters." Eli paid for the supplies and was turning to leave when the door opened and a stranger walked in. The man was maybe in his early 40s, dressed for travel in good quality clothes that showed the wear of hard use. He was tall, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and eyes that struck Eli with their familiarity. They were Thomas's eyes, that particular shade of grey-green that their mother had passed down to her younger son. The stranger nodded politely to both of them, his gaze lingering on Eli for just a moment longer than casual courtesy required. There was something in that look, a recognition or maybe an assessment, before he turned his attention to Margaret. "Ma'am, I'm looking for supplies for a few days in the high country. Wondering if you might help me with that?" His voice was measured, with an accent that suggested Wyoming or maybe northern Colorado. A voice that sounded nothing like Thomas's, but somehow reminded Eli of his brother all the same, in its cadence or its careful choice of words. Eli's heart was hammering in his chest. Could this be Daniel? Was his nephew, standing not 10 feet away, pretending to be a stranger, watching Eli's reaction to see if the old man would recognize him? "Where are you headed, if you don't mind my asking?" Eli heard himself say, his voice rough with sudden emotion. The stranger met his eyes again, and this time the look was unmistakable. This man knew exactly who Eli was, and he was waiting to see what Eli would do with that knowledge. "Northeast," the stranger said. "Into the high valleys. I've heard there's beautiful country up that way, worth seeing before winter locks it down completely. Northeast. The same direction the donkey called toward every evening. The same direction Eli had been preparing to travel." Eli opened his mouth to say something, to ask the questions burning in his throat, but the stranger had already turned back to Margaret, and the moment passed. By the time Margaret had finished gathering the supplies, Eli had lost his nerve. He left the store without speaking again, the stranger's words echoing in his head. Northeast, beautiful country, worth seeing. It wasn't until he was back at his cabin, packing the last of his gear, that Eli checked the donkey's saddlebags more thoroughly. He'd gone through them before, of course, looking for clues, but he'd been focused on the obvious things. Now, running his hands along the lining, he felt something hard and round in a hidden pocket stitched into the leather. His fingers found the small opening and pulled out a silver pocket watch. He knew it immediately, even before he opened the case to confirm. His father's watch, the one Samuel had given to Thomas the day he left, pressed into his hand with the words, "So you'll always know it's time to come home." Eli had forgotten about that watch, had put it out of his mind along with everything else connected to Thomas. But here it was, solid and real in his palm. The silver worn smooth in places from being carried in someone's pocket for decades. The watch still worked, keeping perfect time as if it had been wound that very morning. Eli turned it over, looking for the inscription his father had put on the back when he first bought it, S. Brecker, 1835, but there was something new as well. A second line added below the first, in a more modern script, "Time doesn't erase family." The words blurred as Eli's eyes filled with tears he hadn't let himself cry in 45 years. Time doesn't erase family. It was a message from Thomas, or from Daniel, or from both of them across the years. A reminder that whatever had been broken could still be mended, that the compass of blood and bone still pointed true even when everything else was lost. Eli sat on his cabin floor, holding his father's watch, and felt the last of his resistance crumble. He would follow the donkey northeast into the mountains. He would find Daniel, or let Daniel find him. He would complete the journey Thomas had started and finish what his brother had been too afraid to complete. The watch ticked steadily in his hand, each second a heartbeat counting down to reunion. The journey into the high country began at first light, with Prophet carrying Eli and the donkey following on a lead rope. Rusty ranged ahead as always, his nose to the ground, reading stories in scent that Eli could only imagine. The morning was crisp and clear, frost glittering on every surface. The kind of cold that made your breath visible and your fingers ache inside your gloves. They followed game trails at first, paths Eli knew from decades of scouting. But as the day wore on and the terrain grew steeper, the donkey began to pull toward routes Eli wouldn't have chosen, narrow defiles between rocks, switchbacks that seemed to lead nowhere, but then opened onto hidden passes. The animal moved with purpose, as if it had traveled this way many times before. And after the third time, Eli tried to correct their course, only to find the donkey's way was better. He stopped fighting and let the animal lead. The mountains rose around them, stone and snow and silence. This was country Eli knew in the general sense, but had never explored thoroughly. The valleys here were too remote for regular traffic, the winters too harsh for permanent settlement. A man could disappear into these mountains and never be found, could build a life away from the world and its judgments. Maybe that's what Thomas had done. Maybe this was where he'd gone after Wyoming. When he'd finally worked up the courage to come back toward Montana, but not quite enough courage to face his brother directly. By midday, Eli's body was reminding him of his age in ways he couldn't ignore. His knees ached from gripping Prophet's sides on the steep climbs. His lower back sent sharp complaints every time the horse stumbled on loose rock. His hands were cramping around the reins, the old arthritis that had been bothering him for years, made worse by the cold. He'd been young the last time he saw Thomas, young enough that physical discomfort was just something to push through without much thought. Now pushing 70, every mile felt like 2, and he found himself wondering if he'd been a fool to think he could make this journey. But then he'd remember the watch in his pocket, the journal pages tucked in his saddlebag, the photograph of 3 men who'd loved each other before pride got in the way, and he'd urge Prophet forward for another hour, during a rest stop by a stream, while the animals drank and Eli chewed on jerky that seemed to require more effort than it was worth. His thoughts circled back to that last day with Thomas. He'd replayed the argument so many times over the years that it had taken on the quality of a story told by someone else, something that had happened to different people in a different life, but it hadn't been different people. It had been him and Thomas, both grieving their father in different ways, both scared of a future that suddenly had no clear path forward. Samuel had been the anchor that held them together, and without him, they drifted into conflict as naturally as boats slipped their moorings. Thomas had wanted to try prospecting, wanted to see if he could find gold in the hills around South Pass. It wasn't a ridiculous dream. Men were making fortunes in those years, and Thomas had the skills to survive in rough country. But Eli had seen it as abandonment, as Thomas turning his back on everything their father had built, on the responsibility that came with being a Brecker. "We have land here," Eli had said, his voice tight with anger and fear he couldn't name. "We have a reputation. Bus spent his whole life building something that would last, and you want to throw it away, chasing a fool's dream." "I'm not throwing anything away," Thomas had replied, his own anger rising to meet Eli's. "I'm trying to find my own path." "Is that so wrong? Do I have to spend my whole life living in Pa's shadow, doing exactly what he did, never trying to be anything on my own?" "That's not what I meant, isn't it? You've always been the good son, Eli, the one who did everything right, who never questioned, who never wanted anything different. And I'm happy for you, truly I am. But I'm not you. I need to try things, to see if I can make my own way." "Why can't you understand that?" "Because it's not just about you," Eli had said, and this was where it had gone wrong, where his tongue had run ahead of his judgment. "Because when you fail, and you will fail, you'll come crawling back expecting me to clean up your mess. And I'll be the one who has to explain to everyone in Copper Ridge why the younger Brecker boy couldn't make it work, why he wasn't man enough to honor his father's memory." The words had hung in the air between them like a physical presence, sharp and cutting. Thomas's face had gone pale, then red, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. "Is that what you think of me? That I'm not man enough? That I'm bound to fail?" Eli should have taken it back then, should have said he was speaking out of fear, that he was scared of losing the only family he had left. But he'd been 24 and full of his own importance, and instead he'd doubled down. "I think you're a dreamer, Tom, and dreams don't put food on the table or keep a roof over your head. Sooner you learn that, better off you'll be." Thomas had packed his things in silence after that, moving with a careful precision that spoke of barely controlled rage. When he'd mounted up to leave, he'd looked down at Eli with something in his eyes that Eli had spent 45 years trying to forget. "You know what your problem is, Eli? You're so busy being responsible, being the man Pa wanted you to be, that you forgot how to be human. You forgot that people matter more than land, that family is more than just duty. I hope you figure that out someday, before you wake up alone and realize you pushed away everyone who ever cared about you." Then he'd ridden out, and Eli had stood there watching him go, too proud to call him back, too stubborn to admit that maybe, just maybe, Thomas had a point. Now, sitting by this mountain stream with the water running cold over ancient stone, Eli understood what he'd been too young to see then. He hadn't been protecting his father's legacy. He'd been scared. Scared of change, scared of being alone, scared that without Thomas there, he'd have to face the fact that the life his father had built might not be enough for him either. So he'd lashed out, said the words that would hurt the most, driven his brother away before Thomas could choose to leave on his own. And he'd spent the next 45 years proving Thomas right, pushing away any connection that might threaten the careful isolation he'd built around himself. "Not too late, though," he said aloud. And Rusty looked up from where he'd been investigating an interesting scent, his tail wagging once. Not too late to be different, to do better. They rode on as the afternoon shadows lengthened. The donkey picked a path that wound higher and higher, until Eli could look back and see the valleys spread below, like a map of his life, all the familiar trails and known places growing small and distant. Ahead, the mountains held secrets he was only beginning to uncover. As the sun touched the western peaks, they came to a place where 3 trails met, each heading in a different direction. The donkey stopped here braying once, and Rusty ran forward to investigate something lying on a flat rock at the junction. Eli dismounted with a grunt and walked over to see what the dog had found. It was a piece of paper held in place by a smooth river stone. He picked it up and unfolded it carefully, his hands shaking from more than just the cold. A map, hand-drawn on fresh paper, showing the trail ahead. It detailed valleys and passes, marked water sources and good camping spots, and at the end, in a small valley Eli had never known existed, there was an X with the words "home" written beside it. At the bottom of the map, in the same neat script he'd seen on the journal pages, was a signature, Thomas Brecker, and below that, a date from 5 years ago. Eli turned the paper over and found more writing, "For Daniel, so he can always find his way home. And if you're reading this, brother, I hope you'll come too. It's not too late. It's never too late." The sun was setting now, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and Eli stood at this crossroads holding a map his brother had drawn, a map that said it wasn't too late. Thomas had believed that even after all the years and silence, had held onto that hope and passed it to his son, along with the instruction to find Eli when the time came. They made camp at the crossroads that night, Eli building a fire and setting coffee to boil while the animals rested. The stars came out one by one, filling the sky with cold brilliance, and Eli sat by the fire thinking about paths taken and not taken, about words said and unsaid, about the weight of regret and the possibility of redemption. "I was wrong. Tom," he said to the darkness and the stars and the memory of his brother, "I was scared and young and stupid, and I said things I didn't mean. Or maybe I did mean them then, but I was wrong to think them. You deserved better than that. You deserved a brother who supported your dreams instead of crushing them." The fire crackled and popped, and somewhere in the distance an owl called. Rusty lay beside him, warm and solid, and the donkey and prophet stood together in the small circle of firelight, at peace with each other in the night. "But if it's not too late," Eli continued, "if your boy is out there waiting, then I'll do right by him. I'll be the uncle I should have been to him all along, the brother I should have been to you. I can't change the past, Tom, but maybe I can help build a different future. That's got to count for something." The only answer was the wind through the pines and the steady ticking of his father's watch in his pocket, keeping time like it had kept time for 3 generations of Brecker men. Time that didn't erase family, but gave them chances to do better, to be better, to find their way home even after the longest wandering. In the morning, they would follow the map northeast into the hidden valley. Tonight, Eli allowed himself to hope that at the end of this trail, there would be forgiveness and family and a chance to complete what Thomas had left unfinished. The valley appeared exactly where the map said it would. nestled between two ridges in a place that seemed to exist outside the normal geography of the mountains. It was small, maybe a mile across, with a creek running through it and a stand of aspen that would be gold in autumn, but now stood bare and white against the snow. A cabin sat near the creek, smoke rising from its chimney in a steady column that spoke of someone home and expecting visitors. It was well built, the logs chinked tight against the weather, the roof solid, with a small barn off to one side and a vegetable garden, dormant now for winter. Laid out with careful attention to detail, the donkey brayed once, loud and insistent, as if announcing their arrival. Rusty's ears went forward, his tail wagging, showing none of the caution he usually displayed around strangers. The dog seemed to recognize this place, or maybe he recognized something in the air, some scent or presence that said family, before Eli could dismount. The cabin door opened. The man who stepped out was tall and lean, dressed in work clothes that showed the wear of daily labor. He was maybe 42 or 43, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that was weathered in the way that comes from outdoor living rather than age. But it was his eyes that caught Eli and held him, Thomas's eyes, that grey-green color that had been their mother's, looking out from a face that was younger but carried the same quiet intelligence. "Uncle Eli," the man said, and his voice carried a tremor of emotion that he was clearly trying to control. "I'm Daniel Brecker, Thomas's son. I've been waiting for you." Eli climbed down from Prophet, his legs shaky from more than just the long ride. He stood there in the snow, looking at this nephew he'd never known, and felt 45 years of accumulated grief and regret threaten to overwhelm him. "Daniel," he managed, "I found the donkey, the bridle, the map, all of it, I know. I left it for you to find." Daniel stepped forward, his hands open and empty in the universal gesture of peace. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, with puzzles and mysteries, but I didn't know how else to reach you. My father, he talked about you all the time, but he also said you'd made it clear you didn't want anything to do with him. I was afraid if I just showed up in Copper Ridge and knocked on your door, you'd turn me away before I could explain." "I wouldn't have," Eli said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. A month ago, maybe he would have. Before the donkey, before the photograph, before he'd begun to understand what he'd thrown away all those years ago. "Come inside," Daniel said, "please. You've ridden a long way, and there's much we need to talk about. And Uncle Eli, I need to tell you something about my father, something that's going to be hard to hear." The cabin interior was warm and welcoming, everything in its place, with the careful organization of a man who lived alone and had no one to make excuses to. There was a stone fireplace with a fire burning bright, a kitchen area with a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and in the corner, a bed covered with a quilt that showed the distinctive pattern of careful handwork. On the walls hung examples of leatherwork, bridles, saddles, belts, all showing that same star pattern Eli had recognized on the donkey's bridle. Daniel poured coffee, and they sat at the table, the silence between them heavy with things that needed saying. Finally, Daniel took a breath and began. "My father died 6 months ago," he said, and Eli felt the words hit him like a physical blow. It was his heart in the end. He'd been having trouble for a year or more, but he was stubborn about seeing doctors, said he'd lived his life, and when it was his time, he'd go without complaining. Eli couldn't speak. The hope he'd been carrying, the possibility that maybe Thomas was still out there, still alive, still reachable, crumbled like dry leaves. "He talked about you in those last weeks," Daniel continued, his voice gentle. "He told me everything about the argument, about why he left, about all the years he wanted to come back but couldn't. He made me promise that after he was gone, I'd find you. That I'd tell you he was sorry, that he'd always loved you, that he knew he'd been a coward for not coming home himself." "He wasn't the coward," Eli said, his voice rough. "I was. I said terrible things to him, Daniel. I told him he'd fail, that he wasn't man enough. What kind of brother says that? The kind who was 24 years old and scared out of his mind," Daniel replied. "The kind who just lost his father and didn't know how to handle it. My father never blamed you for those words, Uncle Eli. He blamed himself for running away instead of staying to work things out. He carried that regret his whole life. Eli put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. He'd cried when Martha died, cried when his father passed, but those tears had been clean, the grief expected and socially acceptable. These tears were different, wrenched from a place so deep inside him that he'd almost forgotten it existed. They were for Thomas, yes, but also for himself, for the man he'd been and the man he might have become if he'd chosen forgiveness over pride. Daniel waited, patient and quiet, until the storm passed. Then he said, "Would you like to see where he's buried? It's not far, just up on the hillside." He picked the spot himself, said he wanted to be able to see down into the valley and up at the mountains, to be in between the places he loved. The grave was exactly as Daniel had described it, on a gentle slope with a view that stretched across the valley and up toward the peaks. A simple wooden cross marked the spot, with Thomas's name and dates carved into the wood. Thomas Samuel Brecker, 1840-1880. Beside the grave, someone had built a small cairn of river stones. Each one placed with care, Eli knelt in the snow beside his brother's grave, one hand on the cold earth, and tried to find words that could bridge 45 years of silence. "I'm sorry, Tom," he said finally, "for what I said, for what I didn't say, for all the years we lost because I was too proud to admit I was wrong. I hope wherever you are you can hear this, and know that I never stopped being your brother, even when I pretended I wasn't." He stayed there for a long time, Daniel standing back respectfully, giving Eli the privacy of his grief. When he finally stood, his knees protesting the cold and the kneeling, Daniel was wiping at his own eyes. "He would have been glad to know you came," Daniel said. "Even if it was too late for the two of you to reconcile in person, he would have been glad." As they walked back to the cabin, Daniel talked about Thomas's life after he left Montana. The prospecting hadn't worked out, just as Eli had predicted, but Thomas had found his calling in leatherwork. He'd moved around for years, always heading generally northward, working in Wyoming and Dakota territory, and finally settling here in this hidden valley about 15 years ago. "He married my mother in Wyoming," Daniel explained. "She was the daughter of a horse trader, knew quality leatherwork when she saw it. They had 2 years together before I came along, and then she died in childbirth. My father raised me alone after that, taught me everything he knew about working leather, about tracking and hunting, about being honorable even when no one was watching. He sounds like he was a good father," Eli said. "He was the best. But there was always a sadness in him, Uncle Eli, a hole that nothing could fill. He told me about you, about Copper Ridge, about the family he'd left behind. Said you were the finest scout in Montana territory, that you could read trail sign like other men read books. He kept newspaper clippings about you, any mention of scouting work you'd done or people you'd helped. He was proud of you, even from a distance." They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of orange and gold. Daniel started a fire and began preparing food, while Eli sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything he'd learned. Thomas had kept track of him, had been proud of him, had never stopped caring, despite everything. After they'd eaten, Daniel pulled a thick envelope from a trunk in the corner. The paper was yellowed with age at the bottom, fresher toward the top, and it was thick with pages that had been folded and unfolded many times. "This is what my father really wanted you to have," Daniel said, handing the envelope to Eli. "He started writing these letters to you right after he left. Kept writing them for 40 years. Never sent a single one, but he couldn't stop trying to say what needed to be said. He made me promise I'd give them to you if I ever found you. Said maybe they'd help you understand that he never blamed you, that he knew the fault was as much his as yours, that all he ever wanted was his brother back." Eli held the envelope with shaking hands, feeling the weight of it, the accumulated words of 4 decades. Thomas had written to him, had poured his heart onto paper year after year, even knowing the letters would never be read. It was the most profound declaration of love Eli could imagine, and the most heartbreaking. "I can't read them right now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I need time, Daniel. I need to sit with this, to understand it all. I know. And you can stay here as long as you need. This was my father's home, but it can be yours too, for as long as you want it. Your family, Uncle Eli. The last of my father's family. And that makes you precious to me. That night, Eli lay in the loft of the cabin, the envelope of letters on his chest, and stared up at the rough-hewn beams while Daniel slept in the bed below. Outside, the donkey and Prophet were settled in the barn with Rusty standing guard, and the mountains stood silent under stars that had seen everything and judged nothing. Thomas was gone. That was the hard truth, the cold reality that no amount of wishing could change. But Daniel was here, alive and real, offering Eli a connection he'd thought lost forever. A nephew who wanted to know him, to build a relationship, to give Eli a piece of Thomas that death hadn't taken. It wasn't what Eli had hoped for when he started this journey. But maybe, he thought as sleep finally claimed him, maybe it was something even better. A second chance, not with Thomas himself, but with the legacy Thomas had left behind. A chance to be the family he'd failed to be 45 years ago, to honor his brother's memory by loving his brother's son. In the envelope on his chest, 40 years of unsent letters waited to be read. But that could wait until morning. Tonight, Eli would rest in his brother's home, surrounded by the work of Thomas's hands, and know that he hadn't been too late after all. Not for everything. Morning came with the kind of clarity that only exists in high mountain country, the air so clean and cold it almost hurt to breathe. Eli woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and found Daniel already up, moving quietly around the kitchen, as if trying not to disturb his guest. Rusty was curled by the fire, and through the window Eli could see Prophet and the donkey standing close together in the small paddock, their breath steaming in the morning air. "Thought you might be hungry," Daniel said when he saw Eli climbing down from the loft. Trail food gets old after a few days. They ate in companionable silence, the kind that exists between people who are still learning each other, but sense no threat in the learning. Eli found himself watching Daniel's movements, seeing echoes of Thomas in the way he poured coffee, the way his hands moved when he talked, the particular tilt of his head when he was thinking. It was like seeing his brother again, filtered through time and genetics into something similar but not the same. After breakfast, Daniel cleared the table and retrieved the envelope of letters again, setting it between them like an offering. In the morning light, Eli could see how thick it really was, how many pages it contained. A lifetime of words, waiting. "My father added to this collection for 40 years, Daniel said, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. The first letter was written just weeks after he left Montana. The last one just days before he died. He told me once that writing to you, even knowing you'd never read the words, was the only way he could stay connected to the brother he'd lost. It was his confession, his prayer, his way of keeping you alive in his heart." Eli reached out and touched the envelope, feeling the weight of it, the accumulated history. "Did you read them?" "Only the last one. He asked me to, said it was important I understand what he wanted me to do after he was gone. The others, he said they were private, meant for you and you alone. I honored that. Tell me about him," Eli said suddenly. "Before I read these, I need to know who he became. What kind of man he was after he left." Daniel's face softened, and he leaned back in his chair, his gaze going distant as he reached into memory. "He was patient first and foremost. Teaching me leatherwork, he'd never get frustrated when I made mistakes, just show me again and again until I got it right. Said his father had been the same way, that patience was the Brecker family gift." Eli felt something tighten in his chest at the mention of Samuel. Their father had indeed been patient, infinitely so, though Eli had forgotten that in the years since his death. "He was fair," Daniel continued. "When the other kids in Wyoming would try to cheat or cut corners, my father would call them on it, but gently, explaining why honesty mattered more than profit. Said a man's reputation was worth more than gold, and once you lost it, you could never get it back. People trusted him because of that. They knew if Thomas Brecker said something, it was true. He taught you to track everything, Reading sign, understanding weather, finding water in country that looked bone dry. He said his brother was the best scout in Montana, and if I was going to be any kind of tracker at all, I had to meet that standard, even if you'd never see my work. Daniel smiled. I think he was harder on me because of you. Wanted to make sure that if we ever met, you'd see that he'd passed on the family skills properly. They talked for hours, Daniel sharing stories while Eli listened, hungry for every detail. Thomas's life unfolded like a map being drawn in real time. The years of prospecting that had indeed failed, the gradual shift to leatherwork, the reputation he'd built as a craftsman, the meeting with Daniel's mother, Sarah, and their brief, happy marriage. Her death and Thomas's determination to raise their son alone, refusing help from well-meaning neighbors who thought a man couldn't properly care for a baby. He talked about you most when we were working together, Daniel said. Sitting at the bench, tooling leather, he'd tell me about learning the craft from your father, about how you were quick with everything, picked up skills like other people picked up stones. Said you had a gift for seeing the whole of something before you started, while he had to work through it, piece by piece. He admired that about you. I admired his patience, Eli said. His attention to detail. I was always rushing through things, thinking speed was what mattered. Thomas knew better. He understood that some things can't be hurried. As the morning wore into afternoon, Daniel showed Eli around the property. The barn where Thomas had set up his workshop, tools hung with care, each piece maintained and ready for use. The garden plot, where Thomas had grown vegetables in the short mountain summer, planning carefully to make the most of the limited growing season. The small shed where he'd stored firewood, cut and split and stacked with the methodical thoroughness that characterized everything Thomas did. He built all this himself, Daniel explained as they walked. Took him 5 years to get it just right, but he wasn't in a hurry. Said this was his final home, the place he'd chosen to put down roots after years of wandering. He wanted it done properly. Eli ran his hand along the barn wall, feeling the solid craftsmanship in every joint and seam. He learned well from Pa. This is good work. He said that about you once, Daniel replied. Said you'd built your cabin the same way, strong and true, meant to last. Said the Brecker men knew how to build things that would outlive them. As they walked back to the cabin, Eli noticed something he'd missed the night before. A small cemetery plot on the hillside, fenced with split rails. Besides Thomas's grave, there were 2 other markers. Daniel saw him looking and explained, My mother's buried there. My father brought her remains here when he settled this valley, said she should be in the place that became home, and the other is his father's, Samuel. Or rather, it's a marker for him, since he's buried in Montana. But my father wanted a place to remember him, to visit and talk to him the way you talk to the dead when you need their counsel. Eli felt tears prick his eyes again. Thomas had created a memorial for their father, had kept him present in his life and his son's life, had made sure Samuel Brecker wasn't forgotten. It was more than Eli had done, visiting his father's grave only on the anniversary of his death, maintaining it, but never truly communing with the memory of the man. Back in the cabin, as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, Eli finally opened the envelope. His hand shook as he unfolded the first letter, dated 43 years ago, and began to read. Dear Eli, it started. I'm in Wyoming territory now, working a claim that shows some promise. I think of you every day, wondering if you think of me, wondering if you're angry still, or if time has softened the hard words we spoke. I replay that last conversation in my mind, trying to understand where it went wrong, where we lost the thread of being brothers and became something else instead. I think it was fear on both our parts. You were afraid of losing what Pa built, and I was afraid of living my whole life in his shadow, never knowing what I might have been on my own. Neither fear was wrong, but together they were enough to drive us apart. I don't know if you'll ever read this, if I'll ever have the courage to send it. But I need to write it anyway, need to tell you that I'm sorry. Sorry for leaving. Sorry for not being the brother you needed. Sorry for letting pride and stubbornness keep me from coming home. The letter continued, detailing Thomas's early days in Wyoming, his struggles with loneliness and doubt. his gradual acceptance that prospecting wasn't going to work out. It was written in Thomas's careful hand, each word chosen deliberately, and Eli could hear his brother's voice in every line. He read another letter, this one from 5 years later, after Daniel's birth. Thomas wrote about becoming a father, about the terror and wonder of holding his newborn son, about Sarah's death and his determination to honor her memory by being the best father he could be. "I wish you could meet him, Eli," the letter said. "I wish my son could know his uncle, could have that connection to the family I walked away from. But I don't know how to bridge the gap between us. I don't know if you'd want to meet him, or if you've closed that door so thoroughly that nothing could open it again." Eli read through the afternoon and into the evening, Daniel moving quietly around the cabin, giving him space to absorb 40 years of his brother's life in a single sitting. The letters chronicled everything: Thomas's joys and sorrows, his successes and failures, his constant longing for reconciliation that he never quite had the courage to act on. In a letter from 20 years ago, "I came close today, Eli. I rode to within 50 miles of Copper Ridge, planning to find you and say all the things I've written, but never sent. But at the last moment my nerve failed. What if you turned me away? What if you looked at me with the same disappointment I saw in your eyes that last day? The same certainty that I'd failed. I couldn't bear that. So I turn back and I tell myself it's for the best, but I know it's cowardice. I'm ashamed of it, but not enough to overcome it. That's the truth of who I am, brother. A man who loves you from a distance because he's afraid of rejection up close." Eli had to stop reading then, his vision blurred with tears. Thomas had been close, so close, and Eli had never known. They might have passed each other on a trail, might have stood in the same town on the same day, and neither would have known how close they'd come to reunion. The final letter was dated just days before Thomas died. Daniel had read this one, and Eli could see why Thomas had wanted his son to understand. "My time is short now, Eli. I can feel it in my chest, in the way my heart struggles with even simple tasks. The doctor says I have weeks at most, maybe only days, and so I'm writing this last letter to tell you things I should have said 45 years ago. I was wrong to leave the way I did, without trying to work things out. I was wrong to stay away all these years, letting pride and shame keep me from the brother I loved. But I was never wrong about loving you. That's the one thing I got right, even if I couldn't figure out how to show it. I'm asking Daniel to find you after I'm gone, to give you these letters, to bridge the gap I couldn't bridge myself. I hope you'll accept him, Eli. He's a good man, better than I ever was, and he deserves to know his family. Tell him about our father, about our mother, about the Brecker family and where he comes from. Give him the belonging I was too afraid to claim. And if you can find it in your heart, forgive me. Not for my sake, but for yours. Don't carry this weight the way I carried it. Let it go. Be free, your brother always, Thomas." Eli set the final letter down and looked up to find Daniel watching him, his own eyes red. "He loved you," Daniel said simply. "All his life, through everything, he loved you." "I loved him too," Eli replied, his voice breaking. "I just forgot how to show it. I let anger and pride take the place of love, and by the time I realized what I'd done, I thought it was too late to fix it." "It's not too late," Daniel said, moving to sit across from Eli. "Not for us. My father can't be here, but I am. And Uncle Eli, I want to know you. I want to learn about my family, about the grandfather I never met, about the uncle my father talked about all my life. I want you to teach me the things my father couldn't, to fill in the gaps in our family history. If you'll have me." Eli looked at his nephew, this man who was Thomas's legacy and Samuel's descendant, who carried the Brecker name forward into a future Eli had thought was lost. "I'd be honored," he said, "more than honored. Daniel, you're the answer to prayers I didn't know how to pray. You're the second chance I don't deserve but will treasure anyway." They sat together as darkness fell outside, talking about the future for the first time. Daniel wanted to visit Copper Ridge, to meet Doc Harlan and Margaret, and the others who'd known Thomas as a young man. Eli wanted to teach Daniel the trails around Montana Territory, to show him the country their father had loved and Thomas had left behind. They talked about family traditions, about continuing the leatherwork, about maintaining this cabin and the graves on the hillside. And slowly, carefully, they began to build the relationship that Thomas and Eli had lost, creating something new from the ashes of what had been broken. It wasn't the same as having his brother back, but it was something precious in its own right, a connection across generations, a healing of old wounds, a promise that family could survive even the deepest breaches. The night deepened around them. As they talked, the fire burning low, the only sounds the occasional pop of settling logs and the wind moving through the pines outside. Eli felt wrung out, emptied of tears and filled with something he couldn't quite name. Not happiness, not exactly, but maybe acceptance. Maybe the beginning of peace. "There's something I want to show you," Daniel said, rising from his chair. "Something my father would have wanted you to see." He lit a lantern and led Eli out to the barn. The night air was sharp and cold, the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Inside the barn, the animals stirred at their entrance, Prophet nickering softly in recognition. Daniel hung the lantern on a hook and moved to the far wall, where a canvas curtain hung from ceiling to floor. "My father's workshop," Daniel said, pulling the curtain aside. The space revealed was perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, every inch organized, with the care of a craftsman who knew his tools intimately. A workbench ran along one wall, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. Above it, hung on carefully spaced pegs, were leatherworking tools, mallets of various sizes, edge bevelers, stitching awls, knives for cutting and skiving, stamps for tooling patterns, and burnishing tools for finishing edges. Eli stepped closer, his breath catching. He knew these tools. Not these specific pieces, but their like. His father had owned a set just like this, had taught both his sons to use them in the workshop behind the house in Copper Ridge. These would be those very tools, or at least some of them. Thomas must have taken them when he left. The only pieces of his father's legacy he'd claimed. He used these every day, Daniel said quietly, kept them oiled and sharp, treated them like the treasures they were, said they were the last gift his father gave him, even though his father didn't know he was giving them. Eli reached out and picked up a small mallet, feeling its weight, the smooth wood worn to fit a hand. His hand once, Thomas's hand for 40 years, and now Daniel's. 3 generations of Brecker men, all holding the same tools, all learning the same craft. "May I?" Eli asked, gesturing to the workbench. "Please, it's your family's legacy as much as mine." Eli settled onto the stool and examined the tools more closely. Each piece brought back memories, learning to use the edge beveler without gouging, the leather, mastering the pressure needed for clean cuts, understanding how different stamps created different effects. His father's voice echoed in his memory, patient and encouraging, showing him and Thomas the same techniques that generations of leatherworkers had used. "Your father was better at this than I ever was," Eli said, running his fingers over a set of decorative stamps. "I could do the basics, make what needed making. But Thomas, he had the touch for it, the patience and the eye. He said you had other gifts," Daniel replied. "Said you could read a trail the way he could read leather, see what was there and what was missing, understand the story it told. Different skills for different men," Pa used to say. Said what mattered wasn't being good at everything, but being excellent at what chose you. Eli picked up one of the star-shaped stamps, the one Thomas had used on that bridle so many years ago. "This chose Thomas. The mountains and the trails chose me. Both were valid, both were important. I was too young to understand that then." Daniel moved to stand beside him, and together they looked at the array of tools. "Would you like to work on something?" Daniel asked. "I have scraps we could practice on, or if you'd rather I could show you what I'm working on currently." "I'd like that. To work together. To do what your father and I should have been doing all these years." Daniel brought out a piece of leather he'd been tooling, a belt with an intricate pattern of overlapping circles. Eli watched as his nephew worked, seeing Thomas's technique in every movement, seeing their father's teaching in the careful precision. Then Daniel handed him a piece of scrap leather and a simple stamp, and Eli began to work, his hands remembering what his mind had half forgotten. They worked in companionable silence, the kind that exists between craftsmen sharing a task. The barn was cold, but Eli barely noticed, focused on the leather beneath his hands, on the rhythm of mallet and stamp, on the pattern emerging under his efforts. It wasn't beautiful work, not like Daniel's, but it was honest. It was connection. "This is what we lost," Eli said after a while, not looking up from his work. "Not just Thomas and me as brothers, but this. Working together, learning from each other, building something that would last beyond us. We could have taught our children together, passed this on as a family tradition. Instead, we both did it alone in isolation, and the tradition became fractured. But it didn't break," Daniel said. "It survived. My father kept it alive, taught it to me, and now you're here, and we can do this together. Maybe not the way it should have been, but the way it can be now." Eli looked up at his nephew and felt something shift deep in his chest, some frozen place beginning to thaw. "You're right. The past is done, and I can't change it no matter how much I wish I could. But this, right now, this is real. You and me, working with tools that connected 3 generations of Brecker men. That's worth something. Worth everything," Daniel agreed. They worked until the cold finally drove them back to the cabin, carrying the tools they'd used so they could clean and oil them before sleep. It was a ritual Eli remembered from his youth, his father insisting that tools be cared for properly, that they deserved respect for the work they enabled. Inside, warming themselves by the fire, Eli made a decision. "I'd like to stay a few days, if that's all right with you. Get to know you properly. Hear more about your father, maybe show you some of the scouting skills Thomas wrote about." Daniel's smile was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. "I was hoping you'd say that. There's so much I want to learn, so many questions I have. And Uncle Eli, I want you to know that this isn't just about my father. I want to know you for who you are, not just as Thomas's brother. You're my family, and that matters on its own terms." They talked late into the night, sharing stories and asking questions, beginning the slow process of building a relationship from the foundation Thomas had left them. Outside, the mountains stood silent under the stars, witness to this reunion that had come too late for one generation, but just in time for the next. And in the barn, Thomas's tools hung on their pegs, ready for the work of hands that carried his blood and his brother's, ready to continue the tradition into whatever future these 2 men would build together. Morning brought a clarity that only comes after emotional storms have passed, leaving the air clean and the heart somehow lighter despite its burden of new knowledge. Eli woke to find Daniel already up, coffee brewing, and something laid out on the table that hadn't been there the night before. A Bible, old and well-worn, its leather cover soft with handling and marked with the stains of daily use. The kind of book that had been read often and lived with closely, not kept pristine on a shelf, but carried through life as a companion and comfort. "This was my father's," Daniel said, seeing Eli's attention on it. "But it goes back further than that. Your father kept it, and his father before him. It's the Brecker family Bible, the one where births and deaths are recorded, where the family tree is written down so it won't be forgotten." Eli approached the table slowly, his hand reaching out but hesitating to touch, as if the book might burn him. He hadn't seen this Bible in 45 years, hadn't thought about it in decades. His father had kept it in the parlor, would read from it on Sundays, and had carefully maintained the family records in the pages at the front. "May I?" he asked, and Daniel nodded. The leather was warm under Eli's fingers as he opened the cover. The first pages contained the expected genealogy, written in various hands as different generations had added their contributions. Samuel Brecker's birth in 1810, his marriage to Elizabeth Walker in 1837, and then, in his father's careful script, 2 entries: Eli Samuel Brecker, born April 3, 1838. Thomas Samuel Brecker, born June 12, 1840. Eli's vision blurred as he traced his father's handwriting. Remembering Samuel bent over this very page, carefully recording his son's arrivals into the world. Below their births were other entries, added later: their mother's death in 1852, their father's death in 1875, and then, in Thomas's hand, an entry that made Eli's breath catch: Eli Brecker, my brother, September 15th, 1875, the date of their argument, the day Thomas had left. But the entry didn't say estranged or separated. It said my brother, as if Thomas was declaring that fact to the universe, insisting on it despite everything that had happened. Below that entry, there was a blank line, just empty space where another date should have been recorded, where some notation of reconciliation might have been made. Thomas had left it blank, waiting for a reunion that never came, hoping for a future where he could fill in that line with joy instead of sorrow. Eli's hand trembled as he turned to the next page and found Daniel's entry. Daniel Thomas Brecker, born March 7, 1838, to Thomas Samuel Brecker and Sarah Ann Walker. Mother departed this life March 7, 1838. The same day, birth and death together. Joy and sorrow inscribed in the same lines. He never filled in that blank line, Eli said, his voice rough with emotion. All those years, and he left it waiting. He hoped, Daniel said quietly, until the very end. He hoped that someday he'd be able to write the date of your reconciliation, to close the circle that had been broken. But he ran out of time. Eli sank into a chair, the Bible open before him, 45 years of absence contained in that blank line. It was perhaps the most profound thing Thomas had left him. Not words of anger or recrimination, but empty space. Space for healing, space for reunion, space for hope. Would you fill it in now? Daniel asked. Not for my father, because he's beyond needing it, but for yourself and for me, so the family record can be complete, so that blank line doesn't have to stay empty forever. Eli looked up at his nephew, seeing the hope in Daniel's eyes, the need to complete what Thomas had started. What date should I write? Today's date. The day you came here, the day we met. The day the Brecker family was whole again, even if one of us is missing. Daniel brought ink and a pen, and Eli took them with shaking hands. He looked at that blank line for a long moment, thinking about what it represented, what it had cost both him and Thomas to leave it empty for so long. Then carefully, in script that would have made his father proud, he wrote, Reconciliation, November 18th, 1880, Eli and Daniel Brecker, united in memory of Thomas. The ink dried slowly, becoming permanent, becoming history. When it was done, Eli and Daniel both sat staring at the page, at the completion of a record that had been waiting 4.5 decades to be finished. He would have been glad, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion, to know you were here, to know we found each other, to know his son has an uncle, and his brother has a nephew, and the Brecker name goes forward with family intact. Eli closed the Bible carefully and looked across the table at Daniel. Your father left me something more valuable than gold in these letters, this Bible, the trail that led me here. He left me the chance to be better than I was, to do right by you in ways I failed to do right by him. I don't take that lightly, Daniel. You're my family now, and I mean to honor that, and you're mine, Daniel replied. The uncle I always wanted to meet, the connection to a grandfather I never knew. Will you tell me about him? About Samuel Brecker, about what kind of man he was. And so Eli did, spending the morning sharing memories of their father, Samuel's patience, his quiet strength, his belief that a man's word was his bond, and his work was his legacy. He told Daniel about learning to track and scout, about long days in the mountains, with his father teaching him to read the land. He told stories that made Daniel laugh, and others that brought tears to both their eyes. They talked about the future, too. Eli invited Daniel to Copper Ridge to meet Doc Harlan and Margaret and the others who'd known Thomas as a young man. Daniel agreed eagerly, already planning the visit, asking questions about the town and the people. They discussed maintaining the cabin, keeping Thomas's grave tended, preserving the workshop and its tools for whatever future generations might come. We'll honor him by living fully, Eli said as the sun reached its peak. By not letting pride or fear keep us from each other, by building the family connection he wanted but couldn't achieve. That's what he'd want, I think. Not for us to grieve forever, but to take what he left us and make something good from it. Daniel nodded, gripping Eli's hand across the table. To family, then. Past, present, and future. May we do better with what we've been given than those who came before us. To family, Eli echoed, and felt the weight of 45 years finally begin to lift from his shoulders. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still unwritten. And he had a nephew who wanted to help him write it. 2 weeks had passed when Eli and Daniel rode into Copper Ridge together. Prophet carrying Eli and a strong bay gelding carrying Daniel, with the donkey following on a lead rope, healthy now and moving with easy confidence. The sight of Eli returning with a stranger in tow drew curious glances from the townspeople who'd known him as a solitary man for so many years. Margaret was the first to meet them, stepping out of the general store with a knowing smile that suggested she'd suspected something like this might happen. Eli dismounted and helped Daniel with the horses, then turned to face the gathering crowd with a mixture of nervousness and pride he hadn't felt in decades. "Folks," he said, his voice carrying across the street, "I'd like you to meet my nephew, Daniel Brecker, Thomas's son." The name created a ripple of reaction, memories stirring, old stories remembered. Doc Harlan pushed through the crowd, his face showing shock and then joy as he approached Daniel with hand extended. "Thomas's boy," Harlan said, his voice thick. "Lord above, but you have your father's eyes." And his smile, unless I miss my guess, he turned to Eli. "You found him then? Or he found you?" "Bit of both," Eli replied, and couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. "Long story, but we've got time for it." That evening, at the saloon that served as Copper Ridge's gathering place, Daniel shared stories about Thomas's life after he'd left Montana. The townspeople listened with rapt attention as he described his father's skills as a leather worker, his reputation for honesty, his quiet life in the hidden valley. Some of the older residents remembered Thomas, and their reminiscences mixed with Daniel's stories until a complete picture emerged. A good man who'd made a mistake in leaving but had lived honorably thereafter, raising a son alone and building a life worth remembering. "He never forgot this place," Daniel said, looking around at the weathered faces of men and women who'd known his father as a youth. Never forgot the people who'd been part of his growing up. He talked about Copper Ridge, like some men talk about heaven, a place he'd left but always carried with him. Margaret had tears on her face when Daniel finished, and she wasn't alone. The collective memory of the town expanded that night to include Thomas's full story, not just the part where he'd left in anger, but all the years that came after, the life he'd built and the son he'd raised. It was a kind of healing for the whole community, this completion of a story that had been left unfinished for too long. Over the next week, Eli showed Daniel his world, the way Daniel had shown him Thomas's. They walked the trails Eli knew best, and Eli taught his nephew to read, sign the way their father and grandfather had taught him. Daniel proved to be an apt student, quick to see patterns and patient enough to work through the details. They visited Eli's cabin, and Daniel helped with repairs that Eli had been putting off. The two of them working together in the easy rhythm that comes when family helps family. In the evenings, Daniel would work leather in Eli's small workshop, adding to it some of the tools from Thomas's collection that he'd brought with him. The sound of mallet on stamp became familiar, comforting, a connection to the past and a promise for the future. One night, Eli watched as Daniel crafted a new bridle, using techniques that drew from Samuel's teaching, Thomas's refinement, and his own innovations. When it was finished, Daniel presented it to Eli. "For profit," Daniel said, "or for whoever needs it. It's made with what all 3 generations of Brecker men taught me, combined into something new. That's what we're doing here, Uncle Eli, taking what was broken and making something new from it." Eli accepted the bridle with trembling hands, seeing in its tooled leather the continuation of his family's story. The star pattern was there, Thomas's signature work, but integrated with other designs that spoke of evolution and adaptation. It was beautiful and functional, a piece of art that would also serve a practical purpose. Like family itself, he thought, beautiful in its connections, useful in its support. When the time came for Daniel to return to Wyoming, the parting was emotional, but not sorrowful. They stood on Eli's porch in the cold morning air, Rusty pressed against Eli's leg, and the donkey nickering softly from the barn. "I'll be back in the spring," Daniel promised. "And I'll write between now and then. We'll stay connected, Uncle Eli. That's a promise." "I'm counting on it," Eli replied, pulling his nephew into an embrace that felt natural despite their short acquaintance. "Your family, Daniel. That means something now in ways it didn't before." He watched Daniel ride away, the sight echoing that long-ago day when he'd watched Thomas leave. But this time the echo was softer, gentler, because this time it wasn't an ending, but a pause. Daniel would be back. There would be letters and visits, and a continuing relationship. The separation was temporary, not permanent, and that made all the difference. The donkey remained with Eli, a living connection to Thomas and to Daniel. The animal had fulfilled its purpose, leading Eli to the truth he'd needed to find, and now it settled into its new life with the contentment of a creature that knows it's found its proper home. Rusty had adopted the donkey completely, the two animals often standing close together in the paddock, keeping each other company in the way that spoke of genuine affection. Eli returned to his routines, but he was different now. The weight he'd carried for 45 years had lifted, replaced by something lighter and warmer. He moved through his days with a sense of purpose he'd forgotten he could feel, knowing that he had family waiting, that letters would arrive from Daniel, that the spring would bring reunion. In his workshop, the new bridle hung in the place of honor, catching the light from the window and reminding him daily of what he'd gained. On his mantel, next to Martha's photograph and his father's compass, he'd placed the family Bible, opened to the page where he'd filled in that blank line. The reconciliation was recorded now, made official, part of the permanent record that would be passed down to whatever future generations came. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, Eli sat at his table and began a letter to Daniel. The words came easier than he'd expected, flowing from pen to paper as if they'd been waiting years to be written. He told Daniel about his day, about the townspeople who'd asked after him, about plans for the spring when Daniel would return. He wrote about small things and large ones, about the daily texture of life and the deeper currents of feeling that connected them across the miles. When the letter was finished and sealed, Eli stood on his porch and looked out at the mountains, dark shapes against the star-filled sky. Rusty sat beside him, patient and warm, and from the barn came the soft sounds of the animals settling for the night. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the compass, the brass warm from being carried close to his body all day. Opening it, he watched the needle swing and settle, pointing true north the way it always had, reliable and constant, across 3 generations of Brecker men. But north wasn't where Eli was looking anymore. He'd spent 45 years looking backward, toward a past he couldn't change and a brother he couldn't reach. Now finally he was looking forward, toward spring and Daniel's return, toward letters and visits and the slow building of family connections, toward a future that held second chances and new beginnings, even for an old man who thought he'd used up all his chances long ago. The compass pointed north, but Eli's heart pointed toward tomorrow, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, tomorrow felt like somewhere worth going. The past had given him Thomas's gift, not reconciliation with his brother, which death had made impossible, but reconciliation with himself and the family that remained. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything he hadn't known he needed until the day a donkey appeared in an abandoned cabin, carrying with it the breadcrumbs that would lead him home.